The year is 1854, and 19-year-old Margaret Whitmore stands before her bedroom mirror in her family's Yorkshire estate, trembling as her lady's maid fastens the final pearl buttons on her ivory silk wedding gown. The morning light streaming through diamond-paned windows catches the intricate lacework her mother spent months perfecting, each delicate stitch a testament to feminine virtue and domestic accomplishment. Margaret should feel radiant on this day, should embody the glowing bride celebrated in countless romantic novels and sentimental paintings. Instead, terror courses through her veins like ice water. Her mother enters the chamber, resplendent in deep burgundy taffeta, carrying a small leather-bound book that Margaret recognizes with growing dread. This moment, whispered about in hushed conversations among married women, represents the final preparation every Victorian bride must endure. The book contains Dr. William Gregory's Advice to Christian Wives, a manual detailing the sacred duties that await beyond the church doors. What Margaret discovers within these pages will shatter every romantic notion she has ever harboured about marriage, love, and her own humanity. Tonight, Margaret will cease to exist as a person under British law. Her property, her body, her very soul will transfer to her husband as completely as if she were livestock sold at market. The wedding ceremony she approaches is not a celebration of love, but a legal execution disguised as sacrament. The Victorian wedding night represents perhaps the most brutal transformation any woman could endure, a ritualized destruction of female identity that masqueraded as Christian virtue. To understand the horrors that awaited Victorian brides, we must first comprehend the legal doctrine that governed their fate. Coverture, derived from the Norman French word meaning to cover, established that upon marriage, a woman's legal existence became entirely subsumed within her husband's identity. Sir William Blackstone's authoritative legal commentaries declared this principle with chilling clarity. Husband and wife became one person under law, and that person was the husband. The woman simply vanished, her individual rights, properties, and personhood dissolving like sugar in water. This legal obliteration was not metaphorical or symbolic. It represented the binding reality that transformed vibrant, thinking, feeling women into property no different from furniture or livestock. Before marriage, a woman possessed the right to own property, execute contracts, pursue legal remedies, and control her inheritance. The moment she spoke her wedding vows, these rights transferred entirely to her husband. She could no longer sign contracts, could not sue or be sued in her own name, could not own property, and possessed no legal recourse if her husband chose to beat her, confine her, or dispose of her possessions as he saw fit. The wedding ceremony itself became a grotesque performance of this legal death. As the bride spoke her vows, promising to love, honour, and obey, she simultaneously signed away every right that distinguished human beings from chattel. The ring placed upon her finger was not a symbol of eternal love, but a shackle marking her transition from person to possession. The kiss that sealed the marriage represented the last moment she would ever experience as an autonomous human being. Victorian society celebrated this transformation as the highest expression of feminine virtue and Christian duty. Religious authorities proclaimed that women achieved their divine purpose only through complete submission to male authority. The wedding night represented the sacred moment when this submission became physically and legally absolute. Medical authorities supported this spiritual mandate with pseudoscientific theories about female biology that justified every form of domination and abuse. For wealthy brides like Margaret, the wedding night brought additional layers of horror through the elaborate rituals of preparation that preceded the actual ceremony. Mothers and aunts would gather in the days before the wedding to provide explicit instruction about wifely duties that bore no resemblance to the romantic love celebrated in popular literature. These conversations, conducted in whispered tones behind closed doors, revealed the shocking reality that awaited beyond the altar. The medical establishment of Victorian England provided scientific justification for the brutalities that would follow. Leading physicians declared that women possessed fundamentally different mental and emotional capacities than men, making them naturally suited for subjugation. Dr. Henry Maudsley, one of Britain's most respected psychiatrists, proclaimed that female biology made women inherently childlike and incapable of rational thought. These medical opinions carried the weight of scientific fact, providing husbands with moral and intellectual justification for any treatment they chose to inflict. The wedding night itself represented the culmination of months or years of careful preparation designed to ensure the bride's complete psychological submission. Victorian courtship rituals deliberately prevented unmarried couples from spending time alone together, ensuring that brides approached their wedding night in complete ignorance of what awaited them. This ignorance was not accidental, but carefully cultivated to maximize the shock and disorientation that would facilitate the bride's psychological transformation from person to property. The physical realities of Victorian wedding nights were often traumatic beyond modern comprehension. Brides who had never been alone with a man, who had received no education about sexuality or reproduction, suddenly found themselves expected to submit to sexual acts they could not understand or anticipate. The popular medical wisdom of the era declared that virtuous women possess no sexual desires whatsoever, making any resistance to their husband's demands evidence of moral corruption requiring correction. Dr. William Acton's influential medical texts, considered authoritative throughout the Victorian era, declared that healthy women experienced no sexual pleasure and that wives who seemed to enjoy physical intimacy suffered from nymphomania requiring immediate medical intervention. This medical opinion was regularly cited in courts to justify unlimited male sexual access within marriage. Judges ruled that wives who resisted their husband's sexual demands were mentally ill, rather than asserting legitimate personal boundaries. The wedding night also marked the beginning of a woman's complete economic dependence that would persist until death or widowhood. Any money the bride had possessed before marriage, any inheritance she might receive, any wages she might earn through her own labour became her husband's absolute property. Victorian law recognised no concept of separate property within marriage. The husband could spend, save, invest, or simply destroy his wife's assets without consultation or consent. This economic control extended far beyond money and property to encompass every aspect of daily existence. A married woman could not purchase food, clothing, or household necessities without her husband's explicit permission. She could not travel, even to visit family members, without his consent. She could not receive medical treatment, even in cases of serious illness, if her husband objected. The wedding night represented the moment when a woman surrendered not just her body and property, but her basic human agency. The psychological preparation for this surrender began years before the actual wedding, through carefully constructed social expectations about feminine virtue and domestic happiness. Young women were taught from childhood that their ultimate fulfillment lay in marriage and motherhood, that they possessed no value or purpose beyond serving male needs and desires. This indoctrination made resistance to marital subjugation seem not just impractical, but morally wrong. The wedding night took place within a broader social context that normalized and celebrated male dominance in ways that seem shocking to modern sensibilities. Religious sermons regularly proclaimed that wives owed their husbands the same obedience that Christians owed to God. Legal authorities declared that moderate physical correction of wives was not just permissible, but necessary for maintaining proper household order. Medical experts claimed that women's health actually improved when they submitted completely to male authority. Popular culture reinforced these messages through novels, poems, and artwork that romanticized female submission while portraying independent women as tragic figures destined for unhappiness and social rejection. The wedding night represented the moment when these abstract ideals became lived reality, when theoretical submission became physical fact. For working-class brides, The wedding night carried additional horrors related to their economic circumstances. These women often married men they barely knew, matches arranged by families seeking economic advantages or social connections. Their wedding nights frequently took place in cramped, dirty accommodations with no privacy and little ceremony. The romantic trappings that might soften the experience for wealthy brides were entirely absent, leaving only the raw reality of sexual subjugation and legal obliteration. The morning after the wedding night marked the beginning of a new existence that would persist until death or the extremely rare occurrence of legal separation. The woman who had fallen asleep as Margaret Whitmore would awaken as Mrs. James Hartford, her individual identity legally extinct. Her husband now possessed absolute authority over her movements, associations, correspondence, and physical person. She had become, in every meaningful sense, his property. The transformation was immediate and absolute. Where once a young woman had possessed dreams, ambitions, and individual thoughts, there now existed only an extension of her husband's will. The wedding night had accomplished what no other legal proceeding could achieve: the complete erasure of a human being's autonomy while leaving the physical form intact. This metamorphosis represented the Victorian era's most refined cruelty, a systematic destruction of the self that masqueraded as romantic fulfillment. The first weeks following the wedding night revealed the full scope of this transformation through countless small humiliations that gradually eroded any remaining sense of individual identity. When Margaret attempted to continue her correspondence with childhood friends, she discovered that her husband now possessed the legal right to read every letter she received and approve every word she sent. Her private thoughts, once sacred and inviolable, became subject to his scrutiny and censorship. The domestic sphere, celebrated in Victorian literature as woman's natural domain, became a carefully controlled prison where every action required masculine approval. Margaret could not rearrange furniture, select meals, or choose her daily activities without consulting her husband's preferences. The keys to household stores, traditionally symbols of feminine authority, remained firmly in masculine hands, distributed only when specific tasks required completion under careful supervision. Even more devastating was the realization that her own body had become foreign territory over which she possessed no sovereignty. The medical authorities of the era proclaimed that a husband's sexual access to his wife constituted not just a legal right, but a sacred duty. Dr. George Nafis, whose medical texts influenced thousands of Victorian marriages, declared that wives must submit to any sexual demand regardless of their own feelings, health, or circumstances. This medical orthodoxy transformed the marital bedroom into a site of legalized assault that no court would recognize as criminal. Contemporary medical journals published detailed instructions for husbands on managing wives who displayed reluctance or resistance to sexual demands. These texts recommended everything from dietary restrictions to medicinal treatments designed to increase female compliance and reduce any lingering traces of individual will. The horror extended beyond the immediate physical violations to encompass the systematic destruction of emotional and intellectual autonomy. Victorian wives were expected to mirror their husbands' opinions on every subject from politics to literature to religion. Independent thought was not merely discouraged, but actively pathologized by medical authorities who diagnosed intellectual curiosity in married women as a dangerous form of mental illness, requiring immediate correction. Books became weapons in this psychological warfare. Margaret's extensive personal library, accumulated over years of passionate reading, disappeared piece by piece as her husband deemed various volumes inappropriate for feminine consumption. Scientific texts, political treatises, and philosophical works vanished first, followed by any literature that might encourage independent thinking or emotional complexity beyond the narrow range considered suitable for wives. The isolation was perhaps most brutal of all. Victorian society deliberately severed the social connections that might provide married women with alternative perspectives or sources of support, Old friendships withered under the constant scrutiny of husbands who viewed any independent relationship as a potential threat to their absolute authority. Family connections became strained as fathers and brothers, having transferred their authority to the new husband, no longer recognized any obligation to protect their daughter or sister from masculine excess. Religious institutions, which might have provided sanctuary or advocacy, instead reinforced the system of domestic tyranny through sermons that celebrated feminine submission as the highest form of Christian virtue. Ministers regularly preached that wives who questioned their husband's authority committed sins against God himself. The church, rather than offering refuge from domestic brutality, became an additional mechanism for ensuring feminine compliance with masculine demands. The economic dimensions of this control grew more apparent with each passing month. Margaret watched helplessly as her inheritance, carefully preserved by her father for her security, disappeared into investments and expenditures that served only her husband's interests. The dressmaking business she had dreamed of establishing, the charitable work she had planned to support, the artistic pursuits that had once given her life meaning, all became impossible as her financial resources vanished into masculine hands. Even the most basic needs, masculine approval, fluities of life required, clothing, medical care, and shelter, all depended entirely on her husband's generosity and goodwill. This economic dependence created a prison more secure than any physical confinement, as escape would mean not just social death, but literal starvation. The wedding night had initiated a process of systematic impoverishment that ensured permanent submission through desperate necessity. The medical establishment provided additional tools for controlling wives who showed signs of resistance or independent thinking. Physicians routinely diagnosed rebellious wives with hysteria, moral insanity, or other mental disorders that justified increasingly brutal treatments. The threat of commitment to private asylums hung over every married woman like a sword, ready to fall upon any who displayed too much intelligence, creativity, or simple human dignity. Dr. Isaac Baker Brown, president of the Medical Society of London, performed thousands of surgical procedures on married women throughout the 1860s, removing parts of their anatomy that he claimed caused excessive independence or sexual desire. These operations, conducted without anesthesia and often without the patient's consent, represented the ultimate expression of medical misogyny disguised as therapeutic intervention. The psychological techniques employed to maintain feminine submission grew increasingly sophisticated as Victorian marriage evolved. Husbands learned to alternate moments of kindness with periods of cruelty, creating emotional instability that made resistance seem impossible. This systematic manipulation destroyed women's ability to trust their own perceptions or judgments, leaving them entirely dependent on masculine interpretation of reality. Children became additional instruments of control rather than sources of joy or fulfillment. Under coverture, children belonged absolutely to their fathers, with mothers possessing no legal relationship to their own offspring. The threat of permanent separation from children kept many women trapped in marriages that might otherwise have become intolerable. Maternal love, the most powerful force in many women's lives, became a chain that bound them more securely than any physical restraint. The social rituals surrounding Victorian motherhood emphasized feminine sacrifice, while denying women any authority over their children's upbringing, education, or welfare. Mothers were expected to provide constant care and nurturing, while remaining powerless to protect their children from masculine excess or poor judgment. This contradiction created psychological torment that many women found more devastating than physical abuse. The rare women who attempted to challenge this system faced consequences so severe that their failures served as warnings to others contemplating resistance. Legal authorities consistently ruled that wives who left their husbands, regardless of the circumstances, had abandoned their sacred duties and forfeited all rights to property, children, or social recognition. These women became pariahs, cut off from respectable society and forced into poverty or prostitution. The few successful escapes from Victorian marriage required either extraordinary wealth, powerful family connections, or complete abandonment of social respectability. Even these exceptional cases carried enormous costs that most women found prohibitive. The system had been designed with such precision that resistance seemed not just dangerous, but literally impossible for all but the most exceptional individuals. As months turned to years, the psychological transformation that began on the wedding night became complete and irreversible. The vibrant young woman who had once possessed dreams, ambitions, and individual identity gradually disappeared, replaced by a hollow reflection of masculine will. This process of systematic dehumanization represented perhaps the most refined form of cruelty ever devised by civilized society. The Victorian wedding night stands as a monument to humanity's capacity for transforming brutality into virtue, oppression into romance, and systematic cruelty into sacred duty. Behind the elegant facades of respectable homes lived women whose humanity had been carefully, methodically, and legally destroyed. Their stories remind us that civilization's greatest horrors often wear the mask of moral righteousness. The transformation extended beyond the psychological into the realm of physical health, where Victorian medical practice became another instrument of marital control. Pregnancy, rather than representing the natural culmination of married love, became a weapon of systematic subjugation that trapped women in cycles of debilitating illness and mortal danger. With no access to reliable contraception and no legal right to refuse sexual relations, married women faced the constant spectre of pregnancy as an inevitable consequence of their husband's desires. Each pregnancy brought with it a significant chance of death that varied dramatically based on social class and economic circumstances. Wealthy women in London's finest neighbourhoods face mortality rates of approximately 1 death for every 200 births, while their working-class counterparts in Manchester's industrial districts confronted odds as grim as 1 death for every 30 deliveries. These statistics, carefully recorded by parish registers and hospital records, reveal the brutal mathematics of Victorian motherhood, where survival depended largely on accidents of birth and marriage. The medical establishment deliberately increased women's suffering during childbirth despite possessing knowledge and techniques that could have provided relief. Physicians campaigned aggressively to eliminate skilled midwives who had traditionally assisted women during labour, replacing them with male doctors who viewed pain as divinely ordained and morally necessary. Dr. Charles Meigs, whose obstetrics textbook influenced an entire generation of medical practitioners, proclaimed that relieving childbirth pain would rob women of their essential maternal character and interfere with God's sacred design. This medical orthodoxy meant that women endured hours or even days of excruciating labour without any form of pain relief, despite the availability of chloroform and other anaesthetics that were routinely used for male patients undergoing far less traumatic procedures. The screams that echoed from birthing chambers were not unfortunate side effects of medical limitation, but deliberate consequences of masculine medical philosophy that viewed female suffering as spiritually beneficial. The recovery period following childbirth became another opportunity for masculine control to assert itself through medical authority. Women were confined to bed for weeks or months, forbidden from reading, writing, or engaging in any intellectual activity that might strain their supposedly fragile constitutions. This enforced invalidism, prescribed by physicians and enforced by husbands, prevented women from developing any sense of physical strength or mental autonomy that might challenge their domestic subjugation. Working-class women faced even more devastating realities during pregnancy and childbirth. With no legal right to rest during pregnancy and no economic protection for expectant mothers, they continued labouring in factories, mines, and domestic service until the moment of delivery. Parliamentary investigations documented pregnant women crawling through coal mines, hauling heavy carts, working 16-hour shifts in textile mills, and performing back-breaking agricultural labour even while experiencing active contractions. The economic pressures that forced these women to work throughout pregnancy also denied them proper medical care during delivery. Many gave birth alone in cold, unsanitary conditions, with no assistance beyond what their exhausted bodies could provide. The infant mortality rates in working-class districts reached horrifying levels, with some neighbourhoods losing more than half of all babies born within their first year of life. Those children who survived faced immediate separation from their mothers as economic necessity forced women back to work within days of delivery. The emotional bonds between mother and child, celebrated in Victorian literature as sacred and natural, became luxurious families could afford. Working-class mothers watched Yuris that only helplessly as their infants were cared for by elderly neighbours, older siblings, or simply left unattended while parents laboured to earn enough money for basic survival. The legal doctrine of paternal authority meant that mothers possessed no rights regarding their children's welfare, education, or future prospects. Fathers could apprentice children to dangerous trades, sell their labour to factory owners, or simply abandon them without any requirement to consult the women who had borne and nursed them. This absolute paternal control transformed motherhood from a source of joy and fulfillment into another mechanism of feminine subjugation. The constant threat of pregnancy also meant that women's bodies never belonged to themselves but remained perpetually available for masculine use, regardless of health, inclination, or circumstance. Medical texts instructed wives that refusing sexual relations constituted a violation of their marriage contract that could justify any form of correction their husbands chose to inflict. Dr. George Nafis published detailed instructions advising wives that however repugnant their husbands' demands might seem, submission remained their absolute obligation. This medical endorsement of marital rape provided legal and moral justification for sexual violence that modern society recognizes as criminal assault. Victorian courts consistently ruled that wives could not legally refuse sexual relations under any circumstances, even during illness, pregnancy complications, or recovery from childbirth. The concept of consent within marriage simply did not exist in any meaningful legal or social sense. The psychological impact of this sexual subjugation extended far beyond the immediate physical violations. Women learned to dissociate from their own bodies as a survival mechanism, treating their physical selves as separate entities that belonged to others. This mental fragmentation, while protecting sanity in the short term, created lasting damage to women's sense of personal integrity and self-worth that persisted throughout their lives. The social isolation that surrounded Victorian marriage intensified during the vulnerable periods of pregnancy and early motherhood when women most needed support and companionship. Pregnant women were expected to withdraw from social activities and remain largely confined to their homes, ostensibly for their health, but actually to maintain the fiction that reproduction was too delicate and sacred for public acknowledgement. This isolation prevented women from comparing experiences or developing networks of mutual support that might challenge masculine authority. The few women who attempted to share their experiences of pregnancy, childbirth, or marital relations faced immediate social censure for violating the codes of feminine modesty that demanded silence about all aspects of reproductive life. This enforced secrecy meant that each woman faced her trials in isolation, believing her suffering to be unique and her reactions to be evidence of moral weakness rather than normal responses to abnormal circumstances. Religiously, these patterns authorities reinforce of isolation and suffering by proclaiming that pain in childbirth represented divine punishment for Eve's original sin. Ministers regularly preached that women who sought to avoid or minimize reproductive suffering were rebelling against God's sacred design. This theological framework transformed medical neglect and masculine indifference into expressions of Christian virtue that faithful wives were obligated to accept with gratitude and submission. The economic dimensions of reproductive control created additional layers of feminine dependence that made resistance increasingly impossible. Women who bore many children found themselves physically weakened and economically burdened in ways that eliminated any prospect of independence or self-sufficiency. Each pregnancy reduced their capacity for work, while increasing their need for masculine financial support, creating a cycle of dependence that strengthened with each passing year. The medical establishment provided pseudo-scientific justification for this reproductive tyranny through elaborate theories about feminine biology that portrayed women as fundamentally different from men in their mental and physical capacities. Leading physicians declared that women's reproductive organs dominated their entire beings, making them inherently unstable, childlike, and incapable of rational thought or moral judgment. These medical opinions carried tremendous social authority and provided husbands with intellectual justification for any treatment they chose to inflict. Dr. Henry Maudsley, one of Victorian England's most respected psychiatrists, proclaimed that female reproductive cycles created periodic insanity that required constant masculine supervision and control. This medical theory provided legal grounds for committing wives to private asylums whenever they displayed independence, intelligence, or resistance to masculine authority. The threat of psychiatric commitment hung over every married woman like a sword, ready to fall upon any who challenged the system of domestic tyranny. The private asylum system became a dumping ground for inconvenient wives whose husbands sought to dispose of them permanently while maintaining social respectability. Parliamentary investigations revealed hundreds of cases where perfectly sane women had been committed to psychiatric institutions by husbands seeking to control their property, pursue extramarital affairs, or simply eliminate domestic opposition to their authority. These women often remained imprisoned for years or decades with no legal recourse and no hope of release. The treatments inflicted upon women in these institutions represented the ultimate expression of medical misogyny disguised as therapeutic intervention. Physicians prescribed brutal regimens of forced feeding, ice baths, mechanical restraints, and surgical mutilation as cures for feminine independence or intellectual curiosity. Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell's infamous rest cure, inflicted upon thousands of women, involved complete isolation, enforced bed rest, and prohibition of all reading, writing, or mental stimulation designed to break down psychological resistance and create complete dependence upon masculine authority. The horror of these medical treatments was magnified by their presentation as expressions of scientific progress and masculine benevolence. Husbands who committed their wives to such institutions were praised for their dedication to feminine welfare and their commitment to the latest advances in psychiatric medicine. Society viewed these men as loving caregivers rather than systematic abusers, creating a moral framework that transformed cruelty into virtue and oppression into compassion. The few women who survived these institutional horrors and managed to secure release found themselves permanently marked as a former mental patients, making employment, housing, and social acceptance nearly impossible to obtain. Their testimony about asylum conditions was automatically dismissed as the ravings of unstable minds, preventing any meaningful reform or public accountability for the brutalities they had endured. The systematic nature of Victorian marriage's cruelties extended into every aspect of daily existence, through countless small humiliations and restrictions that gradually eroded any remaining sense of personal dignity or individual worth. Women could not travel beyond their immediate neighbourhoods without masculine permission and escort. They could not receive visitors, send correspondence, or engage in conversations without their husband's knowledge and approval. Even their thoughts and emotions became subject to masculine scrutiny and correction through the elaborate system of domestic surveillance that Victorian marriage required. The clothing that women wore, the food they consumed, the books they read, and the activities that filled their days all required masculine approval and reflected masculine preferences, rather than individual choice or personal inclination. This control extended to the most intimate aspects of personal hygiene and bodily care, as husbands possessed legal authority to dictate everything from bathing schedules to medical treatments regardless of their wives' comfort, health, or dignity. The psychological techniques employed to maintain this comprehensive control grew increasingly sophisticated as Victorian marriage evolved throughout the 19th century. Husbands learned to alternate periods of kindness with episodes of cruelty, creating emotional instability that made resistance seem both dangerous and futile. This systematic manipulation destroyed women's ability to trust their own perceptions or maintain consistent emotional equilibrium, leaving them entirely dependent upon masculine interpretation of reality and completely vulnerable to ongoing exploitation and abuse. The social rituals that surrounded Victorian domestic life reinforced these patterns of control through elaborate ceremonies of feminine submission that masqueraded as expressions of romantic love and marital devotion. Women were expected to perform gratitude for their subjugation, to celebrate their own obliteration as evidence of successful femininity, and to encourage other women to embrace similar destruction as the highest form of human fulfillment available to their sex. This performance of domestic bliss required women to suppress every natural human response to degradation and abuse, transforming genuine emotion into theatrical display that served masculine vanity rather than feminine authenticity. The dinner parties, social gatherings, and public appearances that defined Victorian respectability became elaborate stage productions where wives performed happiness while experiencing profound misery, celebrated their marriages while mourning their destroyed identities, and encouraged other women to embrace similar fates while secretly praying for their own deliverance. The economic stranglehold that began on the wedding night tightened with each passing season through systematic policies designed to eliminate any possibility of feminine independence or self-sufficiency. Married women discovered that their previous skills, talents, and accomplishments became legally worthless the moment they exchanged vows, as coverture prevented them from entering contracts, establishing businesses, or earning money in their own names. The dressmaking expertise that might have provided income, the musical abilities that could have generated teaching opportunities, the literary talents that might have supported publication, all became meaningless hobbies rather than potential sources of economic autonomy. The banking system reinforced this economic imprisonment through policies that recognized married women as legal non-entities incapable of financial responsibility or independent judgment. Women who attempted to open accounts, secure loans, or conduct business transactions faced automatic refusal regardless of their wealth, intelligence, or demonstrated competence. Bank managers, operating under legal precedents established by centuries of masculine jurisprudence, viewed married women as extensions of their husbands' financial identities rather than individuals capable of economic decision-making. Even inherited wealth provided no protection against this systematic impoverishment, as marriage laws automatically transferred all feminine property to masculine control, regardless of the source, timing, or conditions of acquisition. Women who inherited substantial fortunes from fathers, relatives, or previous marriages watched helplessly as their new husbands dissipated these resources through gambling, speculation, or simple mismanagement without consultation or accountability. The legal system provided no recourse for wives whose husbands destroyed family wealth, as masculine financial authority was considered absolute and divinely ordained. The few women who possessed substantial independent resources before marriage often found themselves targeted specifically for their wealth rather than courted for their personal qualities, as fortune hunting became an accepted masculine occupation that society celebrated rather than condemned. These marriages represented particularly cynical forms of legalized theft, where charming suitors transformed into financial predators the moment the wedding ceremony concluded. The romantic courtship that preceded such marriages served as elaborate deceptions designed to secure feminine consent to their own economic destruction. Working-class women faced even more devastating economic realities through industrial policies that treated married female labourers as temporary workers whose primary obligations lay in domestic service rather than wage earning. Factory owners routinely paid married women's wages directly to their husbands, even when wives performed the actual labour, creating systems of economic exploitation that benefited both employers and masculine authority. This practice transformed married women into unpaid labourers, whose efforts enriched others while providing them no personal security or independence. the textile mills of Lancashire, the pottery works of Staffordshire, and the match factories of London all employed thousands of married women whose earnings vanished into masculine hands before they could touch them. These women worked grueling shifts in dangerous conditions while remaining financially dependent upon husbands who might spend their wages in taverns before returning home to demand domestic services from wives exhausted by industrial labour. The double burden of wage work and domestic responsibility created physical and emotional strain that frequently resulted in premature death or permanent disability. Agricultural districts presented equally harsh realities for rural wives whose labour contributed substantially to family farms while providing them no legal claim to the land, livestock, or crops they helped produce. Women worked alongside men during planting and harvest seasons, tended animals, maintained gardens, and processed food for market, while remaining legally invisible in all property transactions and financial decisions. Their expertise in agricultural matters, developed over lifetimes of practical experience, counted for nothing when husbands chose to sell land, change crops, or mortgage property for business ventures. The domestic manufacturing that employed many married women in their homes represented another form of economic exploitation disguised as feminine opportunity. Piecework in textile production, artificial flower making, and other handicrafts provided minimal compensation for exhausting labour performed in addition to regular household duties. Women spent long hours hunched over sewing, weaving, or assembly work that damaged their eyesight and created chronic pain while earning barely enough to supplement family income. These occupations, celebrated as appropriate feminine employment, actually represented systematic exploitation of women whose legal vulnerability prevented them from negotiating fair compensation. The credit systems that governed Victorian commerce extended masculine control over feminine consumption in ways that created additional psychological pressure and social humiliation. Married women could not establish credit accounts, make purchases beyond immediate necessities, or conduct business transactions without masculine authorization. This financial dependence meant that women required permission for every expenditure, from household supplies to personal clothing, creating daily reminders of their legal non-existence and economic powerlessness. The charity work that many middle-class women pursued as acceptable feminine activity became another mechanism of control, rather than genuine opportunity for social contribution or personal fulfillment. Husbands determined which charitable causes their wives could support, how much time they could devote to philanthropic activities, and what level of involvement was appropriate for respectable married women. This masculine oversight transformed charitable work into supervised activity rather than independent choice, ensuring that even women's attempts to help others served masculine interests and reflected masculine values. The educational restrictions imposed upon married women represented systematic attempts to prevent intellectual development that might challenge domestic authority or inspire desires for independence. Wives were discouraged or forbidden from reading materials that might stimulate them to alternative, ulate critical thinking, expose ways of life, or provide information about legal rights and social possibilities. Libraries, lecture series, and educational institutions often refused admission to married women without their husbands' explicit written permission, treating it as dangerous feminine intellectual curios to family stability and social order. The few married women who managed to continue their education faced constant interruption and interference from domestic obligations that were deliberately scheduled to prevent sustained intellectual effort. Husbands would create emergencies, demand immediate attention, or simply destroy books and papers when wives displayed too much interest in learning. This sabotage of feminine intellectual development was celebrated as protection of family harmony, rather than recognized as systematic oppression designed to maintain masculine supreme profession provided additional. The medical tools for suppressing feminine intellectual ambition through diagnoses that pathologized learning and creativity and Marianne declared that excessive women. Physicians' rout reading caused hysteria. That intellectual effort damaged reproductive capacity, created mental instability requiring immediate medical intervention. These, and that education's bans with scientific medical opinions, provided huge justification for limiting their wives' access to books, preventing in educational activities, and treating their participationity as evidence of mental intellectual curious illness requiring correction. The social isolation that surrounded Victorian marriage intensified these educational restrictions by preventing married women from forming study groups, attending lectures together, or simply discussing ideas with other women who might share their intellectual interests. The elaborate rules governing social interaction between married women require for all meetings masculine supervision and approval, conversations and correspondence, making independent intellectual development nearly impossible to sustain without detection and punishment. The religious institutions that might have provided alternative sources of education or spiritual growth instead reinforced masculine authority through theological interpretations that celebrated feminine ignorance as evidence of Christian virtue and moral purity. Ministers preached that women who sought knowledge beyond domestic skills were rebelling against divine order and endangering their souls through prideful behavior inappropriate to their sex. Church-sponsored educational programs for women focused exclusively on domestic arts and childcare rather than intellectual development or spiritual exploration. The legal profession systematically excluded married women from any participation in judicial processes that might have provided them with knowledge about their rights for redress against masculine abuse. Women or opportunities witnesses in many could not serve as types of legal proceedings, couldies without masculine, not pursue legal representation, and possessed no standing to challenge laws or seek judicial relief for domestic grievances. This legal invisibility meant that women and of their few remained ignore remaining rights, while being unable to defend themselves against violations of even those minimal protections. The systematic destruction of feminine intellectual capacity extended beyond formal education into the realm of creative expression, where married women found their artistic talents subordinated to domestic utility, rather than valued as sources of personal fulfillment or cultural contribution. Musical abilities were expected to provide family entertainment rather than professional development. Writing skills were channeled into household correspondence rather than literary creation. Artistic talents were directed toward decorative objects for creative work, domestic display, rather than serious that might challenge social conventions or express individual vision. The few women who attempted to continue creative work after marriage discovered that their time, space, and materials were subjectation for domestic purposes that took to constant appropriate precedence over personal expression. Art supplies disappeared into household time was interrupted use, writing by domestic emergencies, and creative spaces were converted to family purposes whenever masculine needs demanded additional room. This systematic elimination of creative opportunity was presented as natural rather than deliberate feminine sacrifice at sub-potential. The publishing ration of Human reinforced these industry-reflected and restrictions by refusing to consider work by married women unless it received masculine endorsement and dealt with subjects deemed appropriate for feminine authorship. The few married women who managed to publish did so under masculine pseudonyms or through husbands who claimed credit for their wives' intellectual labor. This literary invisibility meant that women's perspectives on marriage life remained largely unrecored, motherhood and domestic dead, preventing future nature of feminine experience under generations from understanding the true coverture. The correspondenced women's thoughts and experiences for historical that might have preserved record was subject to masculine censorship that eliminated evidence of feminine suffering, resistance, or intellectual achievement. Husbands routinely read their wives' letters before posting, edited or destroyed correspondence that revealed domestic problems, and prevented the formation of networks through which women might have shared information or provided mutual support. This systematic destruction of feminine communication ensured that most Victorian women's experiences would vanish without trace masculine interpret life for future generations to study. The transformations of domestic the wedding night, thus that began on, represented not just the women, but the systematic erasure of feminine perspective, legal obliteration of individual from the historical record. The horrors endured by millions of Victorian wives disappeared into silence, their stories, their suffering unrecorded, their resistance unacknowledged, by untold. The very society that celebrated marriage as the foundation of Christian civilization and moral progress. The daily reality of this obliteration manifested through countless small cruelties that accumulated into devastating psychological assault upon feminine identity and human dignity. Women learned to anticipate masculine moods, to interpret subtle signals of approval or disapproval, to modify their behavior preemptively to avoid correction or punishment. This constant vigilance created exhaustion that extended far beyond physical tiredness into spiritual depletion, that disconnected from their own humanity, left women feeling hollow, empty, and the performance of happiness became so central to married women's survival that many lost the ability to distinguish between genuine emotion and theatrical display, between authentic feeling and socially required response. This psychological fragmentation made resistance seem impossible. Internal confusion and escape appear literally, once possess unthinkable. Women who had clear sense of their own preferences, opinions and desires found these capacities systematically eroded until they genuinely believed they had no individual identity separate from their husband's will. The horror in its legal brute of Victorian marriage lay not justalities or physical violations, but in its capacity to make women complicit in their own destruction, to transform victims into advocates for the system that oppressed them, to create psychological conditions where suffering appeared normal and resistance seemed both impossible and morally wrong. This represents perhaps the most refined cruelty ever devised by civilized society, a form of systematic dehumanization so complete that its victims learn to celebrate their own obliteration as evidence of virtue, success, and divine favor. The medical establishment's role in perpetuating these domestic horrors extended far beyond simple ignorance or primitive understanding of human physiology. Victorian physicians deliberately constructed elaborate theories that transformed masculine cruelty into therapeutic necessity, creating scientific justifications for brutalities that served no medical purpose whatsoever. These medical authorities possessed sufficient anatomical knowledge to understand the damage their prescribed treatments inflicted, yet they persisted in recommending procedures that maximized feminine suffering while claiming to promote health and moral improvement. The gynecological practices of the era revealed the depths of this medical complicity in domestic tyranny. Physicians routinely performed surgical procedures on married women without anesthesia, claiming that pain purified the feminine soul and corrected moral deficiencies that manifested through physical symptoms. Dr. Marion Sims, celebrated as the father of modern gynecology, conducted experimental surgeries on enslaved women without any form of pain relief, developing techniques that were subsequently applied to free white women with equally callous disregard for their suffering. The surgical removal of healthy reproductive organs became a standard treatment for wives who displayed independence, intellectual curiosity, or resistance to masculine authority. Physicians diagnosed these natural human traits as pathological conditions requiring immediate surgical intervention to prevent the spread of moral contamination throughout the domestic sphere. Thousands of women underwent hysterectomies, ovariotomies, and clitoridectomies, not because of medical necessity, but because their husbands requested procedures that would eliminate troublesome feminine behaviors. These surgical mutilations were performed in private hospitals where screams collectible neighborhoods, where not disturb rest recovery took place in isolation, and where the psychological trauma of bod be processed without witnesses, dilly violation, or support. Women emerged from these procedures physically damaged, and emotionally shattered. Their capacity for sexual pleasure or reproductive, choice in service, permanently destroy of masculine convenience and social conformity. The medical profession's treatment of pregnancy complications revealed equally devastating patterns of systematic neglect designed to maintain feminine dependence rather than preserve maternal health. Physicians who possessed knowledge of antiseptic procedures deliberately withheld these techniques from birthing women, claiming that infections served divine purposes in testing feminine moral strength. The childbed fever that killed thousands of new mothers each year could have been prevented through basic sanitary measures that doctors routinely employed when treating masculine patients. The deliberate withholding of pain relief during childbirth reflected not medical limitation, but philosophical commitment to feminine suffering as spiritually beneficial and socially necessary. Chloroform and ether were readily available throughout the Victorian period, yet physicians refused to administer these substances to labouring women while freely providing them to men, under application of medical knowledge revealed the true priorities going far less traumatic procedures. This selective of a profession that valued masculine comfort above feminine survival. The postpartum treatments prescribed for new mothers created additional opportunities for medical control that extended masculine authority through professional medical opinion. Women were confined to bed for weeks or months after delivery, forbidden from physical activity, intellectual engagement, or social interaction that might restore their sensi. This enfer of personal autonomous invalidism, presented as medical necessity, actually served to maintain the psychological vulnerabilities created by pregnancy and childbirth while preventing the development of maternal confidence that might challenge paternal authority. The diagnostic categories employed by Victorian physicians reflected systematic efforts to pathologize normal feminine responses to abnormal circumstances. Women who grieved the loss of their legal identity were diagnosed with melancholia requiring medical intervention. Those who resented sexual violence were labelled nymphomaniacs, needing surgical correction. Wives who questioned masculine decisions were classified as suffering from moral insanity, demanding institutional commitment. These diagnostic frameworks transformed rational responses to oppression into evidence of mental illness requiring professional treatment. The private asylum system became the ultimate expression of medical authority in service of domestic tyranny, providing husbands with science for permanently ethically sanctioned methods disposing of inconvenient wives while maintaining social respectability. These institutions operated with minimal oversight and maximum secrecy, allowing physicians to experiment with treatments that would have been recognized as torture in any other context. The women confined within these facilities faced systematic programs of psychological destruction designed to eliminate every trace of individual identity or independent thought. The treatments administered in these medical prisons included prolonged isolation, ice restraints, forced baths, mechanical feeding, and experimentalaries that left surge patients permanently disabled or disfigured. Elites as cutting physicians justified these brute-edge therapeutic interventions while collecting substantial fees from 8U to eliminate domestic bands' eager opposition through professional medical services. The women subjected to these procedures often emerged as hollow shells of their former selves, their personalities shattered and their capacity for resistance permanently destroyed. The few women who survived these institutional horrors and managed to secure release discovered that their ordeal had only begun. Society treated former asylum patients as permanently tainted, making employment, housing, and social acceptance nearly impossible to obtain. Their testimony about institutional conditions was automatically dismissed as the ravings of unstable minds, preventing meaningful reform or public accountability for the atrocities they had endured. This socialised that the medical ostracism men's profession's crimes remained hidden while discouraging other women from reporting similar abuses. The pharmaceutical treatments prescribed for married women revealed additional dimensions of medical complicity in domestic control through chemical substances that induced compliance while appearing to address legitimate health concerns. Physicians routinely prescribed laudanum, claudictive substances, tolhydrate, and other aid of domestic UNH wives who complained appiness, creating chemical dependencies that made resistance impossible while providing husbands with additional justifications for restricting feminine autonomy. These Drugianate responses to feminine emotional treatments were presented as compass instability rather than recognized as deliberate programs of chemical subjugation. The medical literature of the period reveals the systematic nature of these pharmaceutical interventions through detailed discussions of optimal dosages for maintaining feminine docility without producing obvious signs of chemical impairment. Physicians shared techniques for gradually increasing medication levels to create psychological dependence while maintaining the appearance of restraints prove therapeutic treatment. These chemical confinement because they eliminated more effective than physical condition resistance from within, while allowing women to continue performing domestic duties. The dietary prescriptions that accompanied these pharmaceutical treatments created additional mechanisms of physical control that weakened women's bodies while claiming to strengthen their moral characters. Physicians recommended severely restrictive diets that eliminated foods believed to stimulate independence or sexual desire, creating nutritional deficiencies that produced the weakness and passivity that masculine authority required. These dietary restrictions were presented as medical wisdom, rather than recognized as systematic programs of physical debilitation designed to eliminate feminine strength and energy. The exercise regimens prescribed for married women reflected similar priorities, recommending activities that reinforce domestic roles while prohibiting physical pursuits that might develop strength, confidence, or social connections outside the domestic sphere. Women were encouraged to engage in light household tasks and gentle walks, while being forbidden from riding, swimming, or participating in sports that might develop physical capabilities or provide opportunities for independent social interaction. This medical guidance ensured that women remained physically weak and socially isolated, while appearing to promote feminine health and well-being. The educational restrictions imposed through medical authority created intellectual poverty that complemented the physical weakening achieved through pharmaceutical and dietary interventions. Physicians declared that reading, writing, and mathematical calculation damaged feminine reproductive capacity while creating mental instabilities that threatened domestic harmony. These medical opinions provided husbands with scientific justification for limiting their wives' access to books, preventing educational pursuits, and treating intellectual curiosity as evidence of medical pathology requiring immediate correction. The social prescriptions offered by medical authorities reinforced these educational restrictions through recommendations that isolated women from potential sources of alternative perspectives or mutual support. Physicians advised against feminine friendships, discouraged correspondence between women, and recommended social interactions only under masculine supervision and approval. These medical guidelines transformed the natural human need for companionship into evidence of pathological dependency, while presenting isolation as therapeutic intervention, beneficial to feminine mental health. The religious, by medical authorities, create interpretations, provided spiritual frameworks that supported these comprehensive programs of control through theological arguments that elevated feminine suffering into expressions of Christian virtue and divine purpose. Physicians declared that women achieved spiritual purification through physical pain, emotional submission, and intellectual limitation, transforming medical abuse into religious obligation that faithful wives were expected to embrace with gratitude and devotion. These medical theological syntheses provided moral justification for any treatment physicians chose to prescribe, while eliminating feminine resistance through appeals to divine authority. The legal protections that might have limited medical abuse were systematically eliminated through professional lobbying that authority as essential to social stability portrayed physician and feminine welfare. The medical establishment successfully argued that wives required protection from their own irrational impulses through professional intervention that superseded both feminine consent and masculine judgment when medical expertise deemed such intervention necessary. These legal frameworks gave physicians unprecedented authority over married women while eliminating accountability for treatments that resulted in permanent disability, psychological destruction, or death arrangements that supported this. The financial medical tyranny created economic incentives for physicians to recommend treatments that maximized both feminine suffering and professional profit without regard for actual medical necessity or therapeutic benefit. Husbands paid substantial fees for procedures that eliminated domestic inconvenience, while physicians collected additional income from prolonged treatments that required ongoing between medical authority and masculine domestic professional supervision. This economic partnership control created systematic programs of abuse, disguised as therapeutic intervention and professional medical care. The training provided aided these patterns. Medical students perpet through educational programs that taught future physicians to view married women as inherently pathological creatures, requiring constant professional intervention to maintain social stability and moral order. Medical schools provided detailed instruction in techniques for diagnosing feminine independence as mental illness, while offering practical guidance for treatments that eliminated troublesome behaviors without producing obvious evidence of professional misconduct. These educational programs ensured that each generation of physicians would continue the systematic abuse of women while believing themselves to be providing compassionate medical care. The research conducted by Victorian medical authorities focused primarily on developing more effective methods for controlling feminine behavior rather than understanding or treating actual disease processes that affected women's health. Medical journals published extensive studies on pharmaceutical combinations that produced optimal levels of feminine compliance, surgical techniques that eliminated specific types of resistance, and institutional treatments that achieved permanent psychological transformation. This research agenda revealed the true priorities of a profession more interested in social control than medical healing. The international correspondence between physicians in different countries facilitated the sharing of techniques for managing troublesome wives through medical intervention, creating global networks of professional collaboration focused on eliminating feminine independence rather than promoting health or treating disease. These professional relationships ensured that medical abuse of women became standardized across national boundaries, while preventing the development of alternative approaches that might have recognized women's fundamental humanity and right to medical care based on actual therapeutic need rather than social convenience. The legacy of this medical complicity in domestic tyranny extended far beyond the Victorian period through institutional practices, professional traditions, and diagnostic frameworks that continue to pathologize normal feminine responses to oppression while providing scientific justification for systematic abuse disguised as medical treatment. The transformation of medical authority from healing profession to instrument of social control represents one of the most devastating betrayals of professional ethics in human history, revealing how scientific knowledge can be corrupted to serve oppression rather than promote human welfare and dignity. The psychological techniques employed to maintain this comprehensive system of control grew increasingly sophisticated as Victorian society perfected methods for destroying feminine identity while maintaining the appearance of domestic harmony and social respectability. Husbands learned to employ alternating patterns of kindness and cruelty that created emotional instability, making resistance seem both dangerous and futile, while preventing the development of consistent opposition to masculine authority. These psychological manipulations proved more effective than physical violence because they attacked the foundations of personality and self-perception rather than merely threatening bodily harm. The isolation imposed upon married women served multiple purposes beyond simply preventing the formation of networks that might provide mutual support or alternative perspectives on domestic experience. This systematic severing of social connections eliminated potential witnesses to domestic abuse, while preventing women from developing relationships that might restore their sense of individual worth or provide practical assistance in cases of emergency. The loneliness that resulted from this isolation created psychological vulnerabilities that made women more dependent upon masculine approval, while reducing their capacity to imagine alternatives to their current circumstances. The economic manipulations that accompanied this psychological warfare created additional layers of dependence that made resistance appear not just difficult, but literally impossible for women who lacked independent financial resources or marketable skills that could provide alternative means of survival. The systematic elimination of feminine economic opportunities ensured that escape from domestic tyranny would result in immediate destitution, homelessness, and social death that appeared worse than continued submission to masculine authority. This economic trap proved more secure than physical confinement because it operated through apparently natural market forces rather than obvious coercion. The religious frameworks that supported this comprehensive oppression provided moral justification for systematic abuse while eliminating feminine resistance through appeals to divine authority that superseded human reason, compassion, or basic decency. The theological arguments employed to justify feminine subjugation transformed cruelty into virtue, oppression into love, and systematic destruction of human dignity into expressions of Christian devotion that faithful wives were expected to embrace with gratitude and joy. These religious interpretations made resistance appear not just impractical, but morally wrong and spiritually damaging to women who had been taught to value their souls above their earthly comfort or personal autonomy. The social rituals that celebrated this system of oppression created community pressure that reinforced individual compliance while preventing the development of critical perspectives that might question the fundamental assumptions underlying Victorian marriage. The elaborate ceremonies surrounding weddings, anniversaries, and domestic achievements required women to perform gratitude for their own other women, to embrace similar destruction as the highest form of feminine fulfillment available within respectable society. These ritu subjugation while encouraging allied celebrations of domestic tyranny made but socially unresistance appear not just dangerous, acceptable, and personally selfish. The educational restrictions that prevented women from developing intellectual resources that might enable them to understand their circumstances or imagine alternatives served to maintain the ignorance necessary for continued submission, while eliminating the knowledge that might inspire resistance or provide practical guidance for escape. The systematic denial of education, information, and intellectual stimulation created mental poverty that complemented the physical and economic deprivations used to maintain feminine dependence. This intellectual starvation ensured that women lacked the conceptual tools necessary to analyze their situation or develop effective strategies for resistance. The medical authority that provided scientific justification for this comprehensive oppression eliminated the possibility of appealing to objective standards of health, welfare, or human dignity that might have provided grounds for challenging masculine domestic authority. The systematic corruption of medical knowledge to serve social control rather than promote healing meant that even the most obvious forms of abuse could interventions beneficial to feminine welfare. This medical complicity made resistance appear not just futile, but actually harmful to women who had been taught to trust be presented as therapeutic professional expertise or judgment. The legal frameworks that supported above their own experienced this system of oppression eliminated every form of recourse that might have provided protection or remedy for domestic abuse, while creating additional mechanisms for punishment that could be employed against women who attempted to seek help or resist masculine authority. The systematic denial of legal standing, property rights, and personal autonomy made resistance literally illegal, while providing husbands with extensive legal powers that could be used to pun form of opposition if any. This legal vulnerability meant that attempts at resistance in additional would result punishment rather than protection or relief. The international dimensions of this oppression ensured that escape through geographic relocation provided no relief abuse while creating from systematic additional vulnerabilities that could be exploited by masculine authority. The legal and social systems that supported domestic tyranny operated across such consistency, national boundaries, with that women could find no sanctuary through travel or emigration. This global nature of feminine oppression eliminated hope for escape while demonstrating the systematic nature of discrimination that transcended relationships ended individual or local customs to fundamental represent features of civil, the westernized society throughout world. The intergenerational transmission of these patterns ensured that each generation of women would face similar oppression while being childhood to accept systematic abuse as natural, trained from inevitable, and morally appropriate for. The educational, their sex, and social conditioning that prepared girls for adult subjugation eliminated resistance before it could develop while creating psychological frameworks that made oppression appear beneficial for rather than harmful. This systematic preparation abuse represented perhaps the most devastating aspect of Victorian domestic tyranny because it eliminated hope for generational change while ensuring the perpetuation of systematic cruelty disguised as social progress and moral advancement. The cultural narratives that celebrated this system of oppression created literary and artistic traditions that romanticized feminine suffering while presenting systematic abuse as evidence of masculine love and devotion. The novels, poems, paintings, and popular songs that dominated Victorian culture provided ideological support for domestic tyranny while eliminating alternative visions of human relationships based on equality, mutual respect, or made resistance appear not just individual dignity. These cultural productions practical, but aesthetically unappealing and emotionally unsatisfying compared to the romantic ideals of feminine sacrifice and masculine protection. The technological developments that might have provided women with new opportunities for independence or resistance were systematically controlled to ensure that innovations served to strengthen rather than weaken the existing system of domestic oppression. The Industrial Revolution, transportation improvements, and communication advances were channeled to increase masculine economic power while maintaining feminine dependence and isolation. This technological control ensured that progress served to perfect rather than eliminate the systematic abuse of women while inhuman, maintaining the appearance of social advancement improvement. The international commerce that connected Victorian society to global markets provided additional mechanisms for exploiting feminine labour, while preventing women from benefiting from expanded economic opportunities that might have provided alternatives to domestic subjugation. The global trade networks that enriched masculine merchants and manufacturers depended upon feminine labour that remained legally invisible and economically unrewarded, while contributing substantially to family wealth and social prosperity. This economic exploitation ensured that women's contributions to social progress remained unacknowledged, while their dependence upon masculine authority appeared natural and inevitable. The scientific developments that revolutionized understanding of natural processes were systematically distorted to provide pseudo-scientific justification for feminine oppression, while eliminating objective standards that might have challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying domestic tyranny. The biological, psychological, and social sciences that emerged during the Victorian period were corrupted from their inception to serve ideological purposes rather than promote genuine understanding of human nature and social relationships. This scientific corruption eliminated the possibility of appealing to empirical evidence or rational analysis in challenging systematic abuse, while providing apparently objective justification for continued oppression. The technological innovations that transformed Victorian society created unprecedented opportunities for expanding systems of domestic surveillance and control that penetrated every aspect of married women's existence with mechanical precision. The telegraph networks that connected distant cities enabled husbands to monitor their wives' activities across vast distances, receiving immediate reports from business associates, family members, and household staff about feminine behavior that deviated from prescribed patterns. This electronic web of communication transformed temporary separations from sources of potential freedom into extended periods of remote supervision, where masculine authority operated through technological intermediaries. The railway systems that revolutionized transportation were systematically employed to strengthen rather than challenge existing patterns of feminine isolation through travel restrictions that required masculine permission and escort for any journey beyond immediate neighborhoods. Station masters received instructions to refuse ticket sales to unaccompanied married women, while hotel proprietors denied accommodation to wives travelling without husbands, creating transportation barriers that made escape attempts virtually impossible to execute without detection and immediate recapture. The ghosts of Victorian marriage haunt us still, their silent screams echoing through generations that believed progress had banished such systematic cruelty. Behind every elegant brownstone facade, beneath every respectable family portrait, lay the broken spirits of women whose humanity was legally obliterated on their wedding nights. These stories demand remembrance, not as historical curiosities, but as warnings about civilization's capacity to transform brutality into virtue while congratulating itself on moral refinement.